Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode, we want to talk about dental practice overhead. As we're getting close to the end of the year, we're often talking with clients, and you're probably talking with your tax advisor about your taxable income and things like that. We often talk with clients, and we always have revenue goals and collection goals. And oftentimes clients will tell us that, hey, I don't feel like I'm making the money that you're telling me I'm making, right, with the taxable bill. Oftentimes it could be that, it's an overhead thing, right? And maybe there's some things that could change with overhead. Now, a lot of times we talk with clients and, they're not exactly sure what falls under overhead. And so today's episode, we want to kind of talk about what is in dental practice overhead, what you can do to improve that. It could be an overhead issue, right? And at your practice, maybe not, but just knowing the background is very important as business owners, right? And again, oftentimes, we celebrate top line revenue. We're doing 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, whatever the number could be. But our take home is, not in par with that. So that's what we want to talk about in today's episode. We have a statistic from the ADA, the American Dental Association, that, the average dental practice overhead is around 62%. So obviously if we can work on that and lower that below average, could be a much more profitable practice. I wanted to kind of first also just kind of jump in and discuss what is considered overhead in a dental practice, right? So think about overhead as all the things that you need to keep your dental practice running, right? So these expenses might not directly generate revenue, but they have costs to obviously, be open and whatnot, right? So, not saying overhead is useless, right? It's essential for growth and stability, right? For your day-to-day operations. Think of things like rent, utilities, supplies, equipment. These are all overhead, right? They don't necessarily being in revenue themselves, but they're combined with other things is a very important factor, right? So obviously the very important thing is to keep check on these overhead to make sure they're in line. You want to kind of talk about what we see with our clients and kind of our feeling on overhead?
Yeah, and so overhead is a very powerful tool if you understand how to break it down, because I like to look at overhead basically is that you've got a control panel, you've got different knobs here, right? And different knobs that you turn will yield you different impacts on your P&L. So if whether you're talking staffing or you're talking marketing, whether you're talking all these different aspects of it, so they're all going to have a different yield on the P&L. So overhead is important to understand in the vacuum of the fact that, okay, what am I trying to accomplish? If you have an established practice, you're gonna look at overhead in a very different way, and some of the normal numbers and benchmarks won't really apply to you. Versus if you're in a growth phase or a startup phase, those benchmarks for those overheads will be very different, and what you're trying to get out of the overhead will be very different. But overhead is a very powerful tool if you understand the whole chunk, but if you understand the specific pieces of it and know the fact that if I move this knob 3 degrees to the right, what is it going to yield me? So when we're talking about successful dentrepreneurs, right? Entrepreneurs are dentists, right? When we talk about successful dentrepreneurs, they have a very key understanding of what knobs do I need. I'm currently in this situation in the year, right? This is what's going on, whether I'm in a slowdown or a pickup or we're at the tail end of the year where people are trying to use insurance up and everything, so we're getting busy or whatever. And so they understand the time period they're in. They understand the stage of the practice that they're in, the life cycle of their practice. And they understand what they're trying to achieve in that vacuum, in that 3-month time period. And therefore, they're able to then understand what knobs do I need to turn and what knobs I do not need to turn in my overhead, right, in order to yield a certain result. That is where you see the successful dentrepreneurs, right, do amazingly well. And so we're going to touch base on some of these things and kind of start taking this big piece, which we call overhead. And it is this fluff word that you hear a lot around in dental Facebook groups and blogs and this and that and everything, and sometimes it's just considered a very intellectual word where people love talking about it, but do we really understand what those metrics are, and in which vacuum are we talking about, and then how turning those specific knobs can really yield you what you want? And remember, one practice is not going to have the same goals as another practice. It depends on what life cycle you're in, right? So when we hear these consultants kind of talk about overhead in a huge vacuum and say, okay, well, all the overhead is this, and we should basically be focusing only on this aspect, and this percentage should be for labor, this person should be for whatever admin or so forth. I think the audience is misguided. They're misguided because if I don't know where I want to go, how can I draw a roadmap to get there? and how can I plan the actions? It's just like a workout plan, right? If am I trying to lose weight? I'm trying to get lean. Am I trying to prepare for a marathon? What am I trying to do, and what stage am I in? All right, in my life cycle, what stage am I in? I'm in shape, but I need more. I need to work my cardio, whatever, right? So based off that, then you start making a diagnosis plan. Okay, let me look at the overhead and figure out what you need to do. So the reason for the long-winded explanation here is the fact that 95% of clients that we talk to, the first inclination, as soon as the collection number drops, is, oh my God, I gotta cut my overhead. Well, what does that mean? And okay, and how is that gonna impact your next 6 months of cash flow, right? Versus, okay, I need to understand my overhead, and I may need to turn this knob a little bit this way to cut costs, but I may need to turn this knob this way to increase costs, right? Because I need to get here. You know what I'm saying? And so the biggest takeaway I would tell people when we're using this very pragmatic word overhead, which is just is used so much in the community. If you just Google dental overhead, and you'll see 10,000 articles on it, right? Is the fact that before making a treatment plan, before making a workout plan, first figure out where we are going, and every person, just like a workout coach will tell you, every person has a different body type, every person has a different goal, every person has a different end goal that they're trying to reach, and based off of that, they need to then understand their own overhead chart.
Right. I think that's a great explanation because of course you guys are all basic dentists, but we're trying to get in thinking that entrepreneur, as Omar mentioned. So I think those are very great points. Before we go into the specific overhead points that we want to talk about, I want to first talk about classification of overhead. Two main categories. So we have fixed and we have variable. And so I just want to kind of give a little bit of background of what is a fixed and what is a variable expense, and then we'll kind of go into detail of some examples of those and the more specific. So let's first talk about fixed expenses. These are expenses that are every month, pretty much the same amount. Doesn't really matter if you see more patients, less patients, right? Do more work, less work. For example, a fixed expense is like rent. You're not paying more rent if you see more patients or less patients, right? It's a fixed amount every month. Another example is like insurance or any other, like fixed subscription cost that you might have that you're paying every month. Doesn't matter if you see 100 patients or 50 or 0, you're gonna have to pay this, right? And on the flip side, there's our variable cost, and this changes based on how much work you're doing. So obviously things like dental supplies or lab costs, those are variable, right? As you see more patients, you're gonna have more supplies, right? More lab. See less patients, it's gonna go down. And so those things are gonna kind of go hand in hand and change, right? And so for our fixed cost, we typically recommend anywhere from about 15 to 30% of your revenue is for fixed costs. For variable, that should also be about it should be more 15 to 20%. Fixed costs are a little bit harder to control, right? When it comes to rent and things like that, because of course it's fixed. Controlling variable costs is probably more practical, right? Because that goes with patient volume. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility with the variable cost to try to, cut cost or work on that, be more efficient. But like I said, before we kind of go into specifics, I wanted to kind of give a little bit overview of what's fixed and what's considered variable, That being said, let's kind of go into our first overhead expense we want to talk about. That's staffing cost, right? So staffing costs can actually be one of the biggest, dental practice overheads, right? It's typically about 25 to 27% of your revenue, quite literally one of the biggest expenses you have. The challenge is finding the right balance, right? So you want to spend wisely on salaries, right? Because you want to have the right staff around you, but you want to be efficient. Do you want to kind of give a little bit in?
Yeah, and so one thing I think, Hamza, really important to add to this is the fact that staff costs does not include doctor comp. Right, so this is your clinical support team. This is your clinical and non-clinical support team. This is again one place where the piece of advice I would give people is the fact that every practice owner, every business person I've talked to, including myself, has always learned the fact that you may think the fact that you could save a buck by going the cheaper route when it comes to staffing, right? But by paying 20% over, but getting a really good hygienist or getting a really good front desk person or getting a very good practice manager, right? It will pay dividends to your practice and an ROI that you wouldn't even expect, right? So again, this is where especially newer practice owners are like, okay, I gotta cut costs everywhere I can. Yeah, if you're a new practice owner, you can't afford a hygienist. You gotta do hygiene yourself, right? But as you're developing and everything, look at your team and make sure the fact that you have the right people in the right seats, right? And this current market, especially in our industry, it's gonna mean the fact that you're gonna have to pay at market or maybe over, but you'll see the dividends of a engaged individual versus a non-engaged individual. And then in this you also start wrapping up your bonus plans or incentive plans, right? So how do you set very specific goals with your team members, and how does that correlate into bonuses? And that rolls into your staffing costs. This does not include your associate cost. Your associate cost should be below the line, right? That should basically be the cost after all the profits are taken. Then there's an associate cost, and then there's a profit for the practice after all doctor compensations have been done. But this is specifically your team costs. As you grow, your team costs will grow because you're going to hire an hygienist where before you didn't, right? As you grow, you're going to hire a practice manager maybe where before you didn't, and you were managing things yourself, or your assistant was managing things. But as your revenue grows, then so you kind of have like staff cost kind of goes like this, right? It goes really high. So if you may in the beginning stages you may be crossing 26-28%, right? Because you're only collecting $300,000-$400,000. Just opened up your doors a few months ago. And then you level out at basically $700,000-$800,000 in collection. That's where you'll see the staff costs kind of level out, right? And then from between here to here, right, which is basically where you're going from 800 to basically 1.2-ish million, you'll see your staff costs as a percentage go down because your staff gets more efficient. You only need to hire one or two additional headcount to get that additional $500,000-$400,000 in billing because your systems are set and so forth, right? And the team has more of a groove and more of an efficiency. Whereas before you may have had staff and everything, but were they fully utilized? Probably not, right? I mean, they probably didn't have enough patients, enough phone calls, enough billing work to do to keep them occupied the whole time, right? And so again, that's where it comes to the nature of understanding the knobs and saying how do we turn it in order to basically get the yield that we want, and being okay with certain percentages where sometimes it may be flashing red at you and saying, oh my gosh, we're in the red as far as this KPI goes, but not really because we've got a game plan and we're trying to get across the hill there, right?
Yeah. And because it's one of the biggest expenses, I think that was a great answer, a great detail, because there's not always one answer, right? There could be different reasons, and like Omar mentioned, as a practice owner, you want to look into see and create a plan, like Omar mentioned, since that could be probably your biggest expense.
Yeah.
The next thing I want to talk about was facility costs. Now, the main component of this is rent, but things like utilities, any other office-related expenses, these are about 7-9%, kind of the average, right, for overhead. So obviously, if your number is higher, you want to kind of see how you get yourself closer to that range, right? Of course, your rent, like there is things that you can do to help maybe, be better on that. And that could be, for instance, like energy efficient light, equipment, right? For example, those could help your utility bills, lower your costs. To make the most of your rent, you want to consider factors like how close you are to your target patients, is parking availability, just overall accessibility, right? So I know obviously rent is a fixed cost, and earlier I mentioned, fixed cost is a little bit harder to wiggle, but things I mentioned, you can try to improve those, be more energy efficient so that your utility bills are down, but working on that cost. And like I said, facility costs, rent, and those things are about 7-9% of your revenue.
Yeah, and so obviously you can't control this cost, but you can control the percentage that you're looking at. And in this scenario, one of the things you want to look at, I always tell to doctors to look at their practice as a factory, right? And I got 5 ops right now, and those 5 ops I could basically be doing, routine, bread and butter dentistry, right? Or I can start maybe layering in maybe implants. Maybe I start layering in other higher value services, right? So by doing that, now that room, which used to generate, 150, 180 in collections, is all of a sudden the same amount of the same 8 hours of open time, right, of office time is now generating 240, right? And so you see a lot of, again, entrepreneurs start doing this and say, okay, let me go and start, I don't want to be full on implants, I don't want to do full on other kinds of work, higher end work, but let me start sprinkling some of that in, right? And you start sprinkling some of that in, and all of a sudden, you're able to think of your facility cost as the fact that every square footage in your office should be somewhere somehow generating revenue, right? When you start looking at that and you start looking at, okay, this square footage, this corner over here, this corner over here, how do I start generating from that, right? And so every op, how do you maximize your revenue from that? Every area of your office should be selling services. In some way or some form, should be selling your service, should be selling your brand, right? And that's where you start utilizing, you start seeing your real estate costs as a percentage going lower because you're sprinkling in other services, and you start really getting the mindset of, okay, I don't need an 8-op practice. How do I maximize this 4 or 5-op practice? And we've seen plenty of 4 or 5-op practice that are very highly utilized, right? And they kill the benchmark, and they're operating at par or better than a 7-op practice, right? And it's just simple math, right? That every square footage should be generating something for your business.
The next thing I want to talk about is clinical cost. So clinical costs are things that are really tied to patient care. So think of like supplies, masks, gloves, toothpaste, even like equipment, things like dental chairs or x-ray machines, lights, right? Things like that. Now, these typically take around 14 to 16% of your practice's overhead. Obviously, it's crucial to have top tier care, right? But there's still a way to control clinical costs so that you're not spending too much, right? And so, oftentimes you can see maybe if you're over ordering supplies, that can make your expense, higher. But looking at those things and kind of trying to control them, right? Maybe you have an inventory software, right, that can track your usage, provide reminders of when to reorder at the right time versus maybe doing it way too early. I know that obviously the big risk or the worry is that if we order it too late, but just finding ways to be more efficient on that side. So you're not over ordering supplies, those go to waste, that variable expense is high. And we're spending money there when, we can better track that, with your equipment, doing proper maintenance, right? So your equipment is up to date and there's no potential maybe equipment breaking or needing to replace it, because obviously that's a big cost. So trying to make the best of the equipment we have, but with proper maintenance, things like that. So clinical costs, this thing's all tied to patient care.
Yeah. And then always remember, clinical costs go up and down based on the type of practice that you're doing. If you're doing more implants, obviously your clinical costs, the dollar spend will be higher, but the revenue also will be higher. So you'll see that kind of even out. And we even, we've had, established practice orders have came and said the fact that we saw he also saw your supply costs go down. Are you buying less and everything? They're like, no, you know what, man. We've been overpaying for like last year and a half, and we were just been so busy growing and building systems and processes, and we had to rebuild the website and all this stuff. We didn't really pay attention to where we were buying it, or even start shopping on vendors. We've been choosing the same vendor for the last 2-3 years, and we just figured we're getting the best price. And so, I was talking to the doctor, and they said the fact that, hey, we set a KPI and a bonus tied to supply costs, for our front desk. They had some extra time, had them start Googling, calling vendors around and everything. I, as a doctor, didn't have time to do that. I thought my vendors giving me the best deal because we've been buddies, and they come to our office every 6 months and bring cookies and cakes, all that fun stuff, right? And they saw it, and they were like, oh man, we saw a drastic price difference, and we started, buying from elsewhere. You'll be surprised at how many practices don't do that. And yes, the doctor is not going to have the time to do that, but that's where I'm talking about taking your people, what you already had, taking and using them in more efficient ways, and then tying a target to them, right? So hey, be able to find a vendor that gives us a lower price on these specific items. You get a bonus for the quarter, right? And then they go out, and now it's their homework to go and hunt and call and so forth in between patients. They're going and finding deals. And I think in the last one meeting that we did, I think it was a $1.6 million practice, and I think they cut almost $35,000 or something crazy like that in supplies. And that they didn't change anything else. They didn't invest in anything else. They literally just tied a bonus to it and had their team members go and do it, and it was a win-win scenario, right? And so that can basically is other ways how clinical costs can be lowered. And obviously the other aspect is just understanding your mix. If you are doing the higher end, you're doing implants, which are more expensive, they cost more versus bread and butter.
Yeah, absolutely. The next overhead I want to talk about is administrative costs. Now this is kind of things that we kind of call it the silent overhead expense, and the reason why is because it could add up, and it's things like your office expense, maybe some subscriptions you have, your practice management software, right? Billing services, things like that. This is what we call administrative costs. Now, these costs typically are around 6 to 8%, of your practice's revenue. Now, again, as we talk about some of these things and how to lower that overhead, it's going to all tie towards efficiency, right? And so a good way to kind of control administrative costs is using automation, right? So automated billing or automated reminders for appointments, so that people are showing up to their appointments, electronic health records, things like that. Using automation, using technology to be more efficient, trying to see which softwares and things like that would help lead to more efficiency, because again, as Omar was mentioning, leveraging everything towards being more efficient, more revenue. And so administrative is an important overhead. It's often the silent one that kind of get build up pretty quickly if you're not looking at these subscriptions or these office expenses. And again, the average is about 6 to 8%, for that administrative cost.
Yeah, that even in our own office, even if it's not done office, like in our own office, like every fourth quarter, I kind of run through all of our recurring billing as far as softwares and stuff, and it's just funny how quickly they creep up on you, and you're like, I'm not even using this software anymore, or this specific add-on anymore, and it's easy to kind of go and identify those and cut those.
Yeah, and then the last overhead expense I want to talk about is discretionary expenses. So discretionary expenses are costs that can be trimmed or even cut, but they don't affect the essential operation of the practice. So it could still affect something, but not the essential part, right? These account for about 2 to 4%. Things like marketing, office decor, business travel, staff entertainment. These are all obviously owner discretionary, controlled by the owner. Now, the big thing that we always say is check whether what these things that you're paying for is actually yielding a result, right? So if you're spending money on marketing, that often could add up, and if you're not seeing a return on your investment, obviously you want to realign that budget or look at that expense. Other things that we talked about, whether it's CE or decor or business travel, things like that, again, just making sure that is it yielding results or is it just an expense? Because while it's great to have that expense, if it's not yielding results, then we want to kind of look at that and see what we can do, right? Another thing that would fall under discretionary expenses is continuing education. Of course, you want to be doing CE to further adding, maybe service lines and things like that. But again, looking to see how much you're spending and is it yielding that result that you're looking for.
In previous episodes, and we've talked about, from an accounting standpoint, we can hammer it on this because, it is in the wrong bucket according to accounting, ways of looking at it. But marketing in our minds is a fixed cost, right? Now, in traditional accounting, it's a variable cost, it's discretionary cost. And so for the purposes of accounting language, we'll put it there. But we've always said the fact that to our clients, we've been a proponent of the fact that marketing is a fixed cost. You should always be marketing. That, you should be setting a budget every year based off your goals. It should be a fixed number, and you're always spending that. That's not a number you pull back. That's not a number. The fact that later on I can now I'm super established, I can turn it off. You can lower, you could temper it, but it is a fixed part of you doing business because you continually acquiring new patient, having a new patient count number be strong and steady or being upward is part of your fixed cost of doing business. So even though it's something you could turn off with a button, and so it's not like fixed, in our minds, it is something that you should always be doing regardless of what situation that you're in, and therefore is a fixed cost. It's a cost of business, right? We always have to be marketing. And we see practices that, after this reach a certain point, that when they drop the market significantly, and then, 6 months later, things kind of taper down, now they're trying to struggle to get back up and everything and get things going again. It's always good to be in that situation where your new patient count number is so high that you control the outcome, and your goal is to get to that level where you have 3,000 plus active 3,000 plus active patients in your directory. And the reason for that is this becomes a power of leverage in marketing, right? While this summer a lot of practices saw a bit of a slowdown, right? When we talk to our bigger practices, those guys have been around for a long time. They either were steady or they grew, and here's the reason why. While this subsect of patients didn't come in for their routine care because maybe they lost their job, maybe their spouse lost their job, maybe they're having cash flow crunch or whatever, right? But their patient pool was so big, the fact that when they started sending out reminders and email blasts and text message blasts to everyone in their patient base who may have had at some point had service with them in the last 3 to 4 years, people who came in for years ago had started coming in and offsetting the people who were regular patients who didn't come in because of insurance reasons. It's that scope, and what happened is over time they built such a big base, right? Now that is a huge asset to have, and what is that asset a correlation of directly of some aspect of marketing, right? And so again, these are the little tricks and things that your entrepreneurs do. And why in even like even while some people are having a harder time this year, when we talk to our most successful practice owners who follow this to the T, who use these specific strategies, and we ask them like, hey, how was this year? And they're like, yeah, costs are up. Yeah, we had to increase our pay on our hygienists and our dental staff, and yeah, rent went up again. But our bottom line, we're making more money, and the question is how? Well, we have such a vast patient base. Well, that came with being disciplined on the marketing aspect, being disciplined on who they're hiring, how they're structuring their bonuses, and so forth, right? So that all kind of ties into your discretionary bucket. But at VC, even though it's not contrary to accounting rules, we count marketing as part of your fixed overhead, because we want you to consistently be spending on it, because we just see the long-term results.
Yeah, and like Omar mentions, it's so important to your growth. Cutting them completely is not necessarily the best move, right? Like Omar said, you find that right balance and seeing that value, right? And so, great points I think you mentioned about, because oftentimes people might think because it's discretional, just cut it completely. But like Omar mentioned, it's not about cutting it completely, it's about finding that right balance. That being said, I wanted to kind of recap, that was kind of our last overhead expense that we want to kind of highlight. And so I just wanted to kind of recap kind of what we talked about today, right? And so big thing that we talked about through all these sections, that overhead is something that can quietly eat into your revenue, right? And your profits. And you could be a very high revenue practice, but because your overhead is also high, you're not taking that take home that you want, right? So the key kind of thing that we want to take away from today is staying aware and taking control, right? Consistently looking at these things, breaking down your costs, avoiding the common pitfalls, right, that we've talked about and highlighted. That will help if your revenue is high, then having, great overhead to get into that goal of whatever your take home is, right? And so if you're a viewer who's, feeling like, hey, I feel like I'm working hard, working multiple days, revenue is good, but I don't see the take home, I advise you to speak with your advisor and look at your overhead and see if there's some wiggle room there. Hopefully today's video kind of give you better insight on what is overhead and how to work on that. But as always, appreciate you joining for us another episode. Thank you.